So I'd just like to welcome everybody to Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel. This is our continuing series of the European Art Series with Jane Oneail from Culturally Curious. Thank you for joining us. We ask everybody to mute themselves if possible, please. That would be terrific. If you can save your questions for the end, we also appreciate that. If you're the type of person who may forget, please put it in the chat and we'll serve it up to Jane as soon as we can. Just a little bit of background on the program and to Jane also. Today's program again is Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel is one of the most beautiful and most famous works of art in the world. Dive into Michelangelo's inspiration and process. Did he really lie down to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel? And consider how the masterwork has been altered by time and restoration. A little bit of Jane Oneail, about her from Culturally Curious. Jane holds a master's in art history from BU and a master's in education from the Harvard University Graduate School of Education. She was born and raised in New Hampshire and has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. So I would like to turn this over to Jane and thank everybody for joining. Lastly, I'd like to say this has also been made possible by a collaboration from many local libraries, and a special shout out from me to the Rockport Friends for generously sponsoring our portion of this. So thank you, Jane. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dana. And thank you to everybody who's taking time out of their day today to learn a little bit more about Michelangelo. You are in for a treat because Michelangelo never disappoints. So we are essentially going on our COVID-free trip to Italy over the next hour and getting up close and personal with really one of the most remarkable painted buildings of all time. And so let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend this next hour together. I've got a little program overview for you here. We're going to get started with Michelangelo's reputation, a brief sort of introduction to the artist without going over all the details of his life, because they don't all necessarily pertain to understanding or help our understanding of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Then we'll turn our attention to the commission, how he got this incredible assignment, how he executed it. Did he really lie down on his back for 4 years in order to make this painting? And then the addition, he was called back to add a little bit more, and then the restoration. So there's a lot to cover here. We'll see a couple of portraits of Michelangelo throughout the program. Many of them are created by the artist Daniele de Volterra, including this one. He was essentially the biggest fan of Michelangelo and painted several portraits of him towards the end of his life. And we get sort of a sense of who he was. This is a sculpture here, also by de Volterra. This is in the collection of the Louvre Museum. Now, Michelangelo, you can see, was born in 1475, which means he really kind of comes of age around this magical year of 1500, which is when most art historians sort of mark the high Renaissance. This is when, right around the time where Da Vinci's painting the Mona Lisa, and all of these big ideas about humanism, about science are sort of coming together. And you have these group of artists that are creating art in a whole new way, capturing human bodies in a whole new way in their paintings. So when he's about 25 years old, everything, it's like he was born at the right time. Let's just put it that way. Now we think of Michelangelo as the classic Renaissance man, meaning that he's multi-talented. And when it comes to Michelangelo, he was a sculptor, painter, and architect. And he was considered to be the best in those three things. And those were considered the top art forms there were. Believe it or not, during this time, people like to rank the art forms in terms of like their most important, the most important and the most difficult. And because he was so good in those three areas in particular, he was just considered the top, the best. And of course, today we still think of him as one of the greatest artists of all time. He's a household name. You could talk to anybody on the street and they would recognize the name Michelangelo, maybe only because he was also the name of a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle, but we all recognize that Michelangelo was an artist who did something really incredible about 500 years ago. So to this day, if you see the Sistine Chapel ceiling, if you see his sculpture of David, people recognize them. There's an immediate familiarity with these things, and it all speaks to this remarkable talent that he had and this continual reputation that he has had since then. Now, this next bullet point here is just one of my favorites. Even while he was alive, during his lifetime, he earns this nickname of Il Divino, the Divine One. Now, I have a brother who's sort of like a blue collar kind of guy, and he just loves this detail of Michelangelo's life. He's like, if only I could walk into a bar and people would say, hey, Il Divino's here, God hands, you know, the guy who can do anything. That's a pretty great reputation to have. So people from all walks of life are still envious today. So finally, we'll end with this idea of how mythology is really intertwined into our understanding of Michelangelo today. There are some stories that are just so good, they perpetuate, they make him larger than life. But in some cases, they're more they're sort of apocryphal. They don't necessarily they're not necessarily wedded to the facts. So as much as possible, I'm going to share the myths and then share the truth as well. But the myths are always a lot of fun. We know a lot about him because there were actually biographies written about him. Once again, during his lifetime, people knew that he was so important. All of this was trying to be people were trying to capture and document. Now, here are just two more portraits of the artist. This is from a little bit later on in his life, decades really after he painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling. The image on the left is by an artist named Jacopo del Conte. This is from 1535. And then over here on the right is another portrait by de Volterra from 1544. But it gives us a sense of who he was. Now, if I'm going to sort of paint a quick picture about Michelangelo's personality. And I think his personality helps to inform sort of our modern understanding of what an artist could or should be like. Michelangelo was prone to melancholy. He had a quick temper. He was solitary. He had a lot of fractious relationships, even with his clients who were very powerful, wealthy people. Now, in addition to this, he was easily frustrated. His work could sort of drive him mad. And so I think even today we have this modern sense of, highly emotional and maybe even depressive artists. That's our archetype that still kind of exists. Whether or not there's any truth to that is probably determined on a person by person basis. Now, Michelangelo grew to be a very wealthy man during his lifetime. He had continual work, really, but he didn't bathe often. He slept in the clothes that he worked in, which meant that they were covered in paint and dust. And you can imagine he smelled pretty bad too. So he was somebody that did not necessarily get along with others, and people wouldn't really want to be near him for the most part. He's pretty easy to identify in a lot of his portraits because he has a broken nose. And that broken nose, maybe you can say it best actually in the portrait bust, that broken nose was apparently a result of a critique amongst art students when he was a young man. And apparently he was a little too highly critical of a colleague's work, and he met the business end of somebody's fist because of it. So we have a sense in terms of who he was. Let's take a look at a couple of early works that he created just leading up to the Sistine Chapel ceiling commission. Now, this is a work that I'm sure almost everybody here has probably seen before. And it's really Michelangelo's early master work. He was not yet 25 years old when he carved the Pietà that we're looking at. This is, of course, in St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican. You walk into the biggest church in Christendom and you turn to the right, and this massive marble sculpture is there. It's a life-size sculpture of the Virgin Mary with the dead Christ who has been taken down off the cross and laid across her lap. And it's a really moving image, and it's beautifully executed. So beautiful, in fact, that the young Michelangelo was so proud of it, he actually snuck back into the church and signed his name across this sash on the Virgin Mary. And afterwards, he was really kind of embarrassed that he did it. These works were sort of bigger than him. He understood that had a higher purpose than him, and he never signed any works after that. So let's talk a little bit about what makes this sculpture particularly powerful, particularly good. Now, he didn't invent this sculpture group type. A Pietà existed for centuries before Michelangelo. But what he does here is he finds this beautiful balance between these two figures. One is upright, one is horizontal, one is clothed, one is nude, one is male, one is female. And instead of focusing on the physical agony that Christ went through, or the emotional agony that Mary is experiencing in this moment, he makes these figures divinely beautiful. And that is what makes them, that their beauty is truly what makes them divine in this moment. Here are the details of their faces, and they are breathtaking. It's amazing to pause and think that somebody could carve this out of marble while they were just, not yet 25 years old. What an incredible talent. And of course, he's idealized both of these figures. Jesus is supposed to be 33. Mary's supposed to be the mother of a 33-year-old man. And of course, she doesn't look like a day over 20. They're just physically perfect, and that is what speaks to their divinity here. Now, Michelangelo is able to capture the elements of their physical being, their corporal selves, in such astonishing detail. I think this is another aspect of this sculpture that really takes your breath away. The way his flesh responds to the pressure of her hand coming up underneath his armpit, the fact that you can still see veins in his arm and hand here. Even it's as though this is the very moment that his blood stops running through his body. It's just so beautifully done, and so true to our experience of the human body. It's breathtaking. So of course, after he accomplishes this incredible sculpture, he is called away from the Vatican back to Florence, where he had been living, and asked to create this sculpture of David, another biblical character. And David was sort of like the mascot of the city of Florence. These were like city-states that were kind of competitive with each other. And so Florence always thought of itself as like the underdog to Rome, which was, the seat of power, seat of religious power, really. So who better to represent this underdog city than David? He's the young boy who could take down a giant in hand-to-hand combat, not with a sword, but with a slingshot. Now, there were depictions of David that existed prior to Michelangelo. And I think really, in order to understand how innovative and remarkable his depiction of David is, you have to look at what came before him. And this sculpture in bronze by the early Italian Renaissance master Donatello gives us a hint at how Michelangelo sort of departs from what came before. So Donatello's David, which was created, I think, about 60 years before Michelangelo's David, is in fact an honest depiction of a very young boy who goes up against a giant. He's nude. He's seen here resting his foot kind of triumphantly on the head of Goliath. He has already taken a sword and taken Goliath's head off, but he's sort of standing in an effeminate way. His little helmet here can almost read as a bonnet. He's got this long hair. There's something about him that seems almost coy and not necessarily triumphant here. The last straw when it came to Donatello's depiction of David is that this feather in Goliath's helmet goes all the way up the inside of Donatello's leg. This was a highly sensual depiction of a very young figure. And in the end, not the kind of hero the Florentine people were looking for. So in comes Michelangelo right around the year 1500, and he's able to create the 17-foot tall depiction of a superhero, right? Or maybe I should say a supermodel. He's got the body of a superhero, but he really just seems to be posing in this moment. He's not a man of action. He's a figure that's sort of staring down his enemy. And there's so much about this that is informed by the classical past, showing that Michelangelo is a man of the moment, because the Renaissance is, the rebirth. It's looking back at the classical past and using ancient works of art like this sculpture called the Spear Bearer to inform works that were being created in the 1500s. And so Michelangelo's David has a very similar pose to the Spear Bearer, with one arm at rest and one leg at rest, one leg at work, and one arm at work. But you can see he's taken the proportions of the spear bearer, which had originally been thought of as being perfect, and even updated them a little bit more, paying so much attention to anatomy here and the idealization of the male form that we can see Michelangelo's has sort of blown past the original model that he is using here. And once again, this attention to detail, the detail of the veins in the hand, the furrowing of the brow over here, everything is breathtaking and remarkable. So all of this brings us back to the Sistine Chapel. But first, for a different kind of commission. We're looking at the Pope, Pope Julius II. This is a portrait of him painted in 1511 by one of Michelangelo's rivals, Raphael. Now, Pope Julius II was known as Papa Terrible. He was there because of nepotism. He was also known as the warrior Pope or the fearsome Pope. Here, he looks like a sweet old grandpa, but he was not necessarily the nicest man. He wanted Michelangelo to start carving his tomb, his forever resting place. And Michelangelo started that process, was continually called away from this project throughout his life. But we can see what Pope Julius II's tomb looks like. And this central figure here, which was most definitely carved by Michelangelo, is the figure of Moses. And once again, we see Michelangelo's ability to capture the human anatomy, to idealize it, to make it look monumental. And if we zoom in on Moses, who kind of looks like a pagan Zeus here with that big long beard and the text or the tablets right at his side, there's a detail here that I just absolutely love. Michelangelo depicted Moses with little goat horns, and he was not the first artist to do this. Over the years, there was a segment of the Bible, Exodus, which had been mistranslated. So when there was a description of rays of light shining from Moses's head, it was mistranslated to like protuberances, essentially. And so for centuries, artists didn't question that and always depicted Moses with horns, and Michelangelo fell right into that tradition. Moses was not, in fact, the devil. That's the reason why he has these goat horns here. So Michelangelo is set up for this great career as a sculptor. So how on earth does he become the painter of what is, at the time of its completion, the largest fresco on the planet? What happens there? Well, it goes back to Papa Terrible again, our Pope Julius II. Here we are looking at St. Peter's Basilica, the largest church in Christendom, and right alongside it is the Sistine Chapel, which is really a little private chapel for the popes and the cardinals. This is a large public space, and this is a much more private space. I should mention that all of this was kind of in the process of being built at the time that Michelangelo is called there. Now, the Sistine Chapel was actually built the same year that Michelangelo was born, in 1475. So by the time we get up to around 1508, which is when Michelangelo starts painting the ceiling, it's kind of ready for a little bit of a rehab. You can see from the exterior of the building that it's very simple. There's not a lot of adornment, but the inside was supposed to be sort of reflective of a Christian soul. The outside is supposed to be simple and humble. You go inside and that's where everything shines. So even prior to Michelangelo ever setting foot in the Sistine Chapel, there was already a really a really sort of high-minded decorative cycle of in terms of the Sistine Chapel. They'd called in some of the greatest early Italian Renaissance painters who had created frescoes all along this upper register of the building here. The ceiling had been painted with a dark blue color and stars. But as the building settled, and because there was construction nearby, the ceiling was starting to crack. And I believe there was even like some chunks of plaster that had fallen out. So the Pope was very interested in getting that ceiling reworked. So why Michelangelo? Well, according to the myths, it was the architect Bramante who was engaged in designing the actual church of the Vatican, St. Peter's, right alongside the Sistine Chapel. And this is his plan over here. And of course, this is what it looks like today. Originally, he was working with an equilateral Greek cross plan. But apparently Bramante was so intimidated by Michelangelo that he was the person that whispered in the Pope's ear, why not get that sculptor guy to paint your ceiling? And this would have been a really good way to kind of derail a rival. I mean, and to take him out of what he did so well, the sculpting, and to put him into something where he wasn't going to necessarily be able to show his talents to his best abilities. So the end result, as we know, is this remarkable set of paintings on the ceiling here. Now, as we look at the Sistine Chapel from this view, I love this view because it reminds us that this is a sort of flattened barrel vaulted ceiling. It's not a flat ceiling. It just has this gentle curve on either side. It's 68 feet off of the ground, so about 70 feet, about 6 stories altogether. It doesn't seem to look that tall because these frescoes on this kind of second level here are about 12 feet tall in their own right. There's more than 5,000 square feet of surface area up here on the ceiling, and more than 300 figures that Michelangelo painted over the 4 years that he worked on this, from 1508 to 1512. And like I said, when he was done, and he finishes it at the age of 37, it was the largest fresco on the planet. Now, just to give you a sense in terms of what he's kind of building off from, these were the best artists of the day down below. You have Botticelli, you have Perugino, and Michelangelo is going to go up there above the rest of them. And I mean, he's sort of forced to prove himself in this moment. So let's talk a little bit about how he got this done. Back to Michelangelo over here. Now, he realized that he was kind of being set up in this moment. He considered himself a sculptor and nothing more. When the Pope commissioned him to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, he insisted he didn't have any talent as a painter. He thought his enemies were setting him up for failure and humiliation. He wanted nothing to do with this project. He just wanted to stick to sculpting. But it was a pretty awkward situation because it's the Pope asking, and I guess you don't say no to the Pope. Now, of course, throughout the years, we've all sort of become aware of the myth, the legend of Michelangelo erecting a scaffolding that he could lie down on and then just raise one arm and paint right above his head, right above his body, in order to create the paintings on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. That was perpetuated by the Charlton Heston movie from the 60s called The Agony and the Ecstasy. And if you're a Disney fan, maybe you've been on Spaceship Earth at Epcot. There's even like a little vignette there where your little ride goes right underneath Michelangelo lying down and painting painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. But we have evidence to prove that this is not the case. In fact, we have Michelangelo's own drawings and words to prove otherwise. Michelangelo wrote a poem about the experience of painting the Sistine Chapel, and alongside it, he drew a little self-portrait of his body standing up and his arm above his head. Imagine standing in that position for 4 years. And here his poem really shows very clearly what that felt like. He said, "I've already grown a goiter from this torture, hunched up here like a cat in Lombardy or anywhere else where the stagnant waters poison. My stomach's squashed under my chin, my beard's pointing at heaven, my brain's crushed in a casket, my breast twists like a harpy's. My brush above me at all time dribbles paint on my face. Dribbles paint so my face makes a fine floor for droppings. My haunches are grinding into my guts. My poor ass strains to work as a counterweight. Every gesture I make is blind and aimless. My skin hangs loose below me. My spine's all knotted from folding over itself. I'm bent taut as a Syrian bow. Because I'm stuck like this, my thoughts are crazy, perfidious tripe. Anyone shoots badly through a crooked blowpipe. My painting is dead. Defend it for me, Giovanni. Protect my honor. I am not in the right place. I am not a painter." That poem always gives me goosebumps because it very clearly shows just where his head was at and where his body was at. Clearly, he was aching and in a lot of discomfort from holding this position for so long. So how exactly did he accomplish it? Well, one of the aspects of being a Renaissance man is not just being able to paint, but to be able to problem solve around the requirements of a painting. So one of the things that Michelangelo did was he invented a scaffold that was sort of like a little arched bridge, sort of like the bridges in Venice that go over the canals. And you can see he essentially drilled holes into the wall of the Sistine Chapel, and he just moved this little bridge along the length of the chapel as he was moving down and working on the painting. So he could, so this little bridge sort of reflected that gentle curve of the ceiling, and it got him as close to the ceiling as he could possibly get. Now, in addition to this little bridge, there were canvases underneath him to sort of capture all the paint and the plaster that was falling underneath. So it wasn't that they all had to fall 6 stories down to the floor. It also meant that nobody standing underneath his scaffolding could see what he was up to. There was a lot of privacy that way, and I think he liked it, but it did make for a lot of nosy looky-loos throughout the process. Now, one of the myths around Michelangelo and creating the Sistine Chapel ceiling is that this was like a solitary process. And we know for a fact that it couldn't be. He needed help in terms of grinding up his pigments, getting the right colors, and he did have help when it came to mixing up the plaster. Because this is a fresco painting, that meant that plaster was mixed and applied to the wall, and then he would paint directly into that wet plaster. And as the plaster dried, his painting would then become a permanent part of the wall. That is the draw for fresco painting. It is very permanent. It lasts for a long time. So we know that he had help with that, but we also know that he became quickly enraged with his assistants because they were adding too much water to that plaster mixture, so much so that there was mold growing on his painting almost immediately. So he did dismiss, I think, almost all of his assistants that were mixing that plaster. But I have no doubt that there were other people helping him out along the way. Now, just to give you a sense in terms of how you make a fresco painting, you would start with a large drawing or a cartoon, an outline of the type of an outline of the figure, let's say you're going to paint, and you would actually poke holes all along these very strong outlines here, and then put up that cartoon up against that wet plaster and essentially shoot charcoal through those holes. And then it was like connect the dots when you started painting. But because you're working against the clock, you're working against plaster drying, you have to add your pigment, add your paint pretty quickly. And then you have to wait for things to dry. So when it comes to a fresco painting, you can usually see which pieces of the picture were worked on a given day. And so a figure like this might take 3, 4, 5 different days just in terms of applying these different colors here. And when you get in really close, you can see the lines of demarcation. He worked on this on the body on one day, the head on a different day. And the Italians even have like a great term that essentially relating like one day's worth of work in terms of making a fresco like this. But it's a process that's driven and determined by the length of time that you need for plaster to dry. So let's zoom back out once again. Here's the entire Sistine Chapel ceiling. It's overwhelming, right? There's a lot of sensory overload when you look at this. Now, as we move along today, we are going to just focus really on these central images that go from the drunkenness of Noah over here to the creation of the universe, the separation of light and dark. And we'll move through this according to the way that Michelangelo painted it, sort of from left to right, sort of doing the story backwards. But one of the things, or just a couple of details here that I think are so important as we get started, the fact that this is, oh, and I should mention too, that we know all the stories and who all of the figures are. So if you wanted to delve deeper into some of the lesser known elements, they're easy to look up. But for our purposes today, I want to hit on a couple of big ideas before we take apart some of those major scenes. The first idea is that Michelangelo painted so many unnecessary figures on this ceiling. He was really doing a whole tour de force of painting. He figured, if I have to do this, I'm going to make it the best work possible. So you can see he's added in some sort of like golden or bronze figures throughout the composition. They kind of look like sculptures. So here is this sculptor who's painting sculptures into his painting, and they sort of dot the canvas. Notice too that they're never in the same position. In addition to that, he's also painting what the Italians call putti. They look like little cherub or cupid, and he's adding them as like more sculptural, sort of faux sculpted elements in this painting. Once again, they're always in different positions. And then on top of that, he's added in these male nude figures that are sort of framing up the major panels along the center of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. They serve no function. They're not part of the story. They're just there as additional ornamentation. And it's because Michelangelo really loves a male nude body, especially an idealized muscular male nude. But once again, it's just like adding work that he didn't need to do. And they're all in different positions. Now, the last element that I want to draw your attention to for a little bit of appreciation is the fact that there is some real architecture here that's built into the painting, but then Michelangelo paints additional architecture with an astute understanding of perspective. This is a curved ceiling here, and he's painting this cornice and like what appears to be the supports for that cornice in a way that when you're standing on the floor here, they look like they are actual parts of the architecture of the building itself. So he's making the architectural ornamentation here, inventing it and making it look so realistic. So let's get started looking at those central panels. And like I said, we're going to start over here where Michelangelo started painting with the stories of Noah, and then we'll work our way along the central axis here and end where Michelangelo ended. Okay, so with the stories of Noah, I'm going to rotate it over here so we can sort of better see them. It's really these top 3 central panels here. And when it comes to Noah, everybody's familiar with the story of Noah's Ark, the flood, and essentially saving all living things from this flood with the ark. Now, when we think of Noah's Ark, we think of animals lining up 2 by 2, right? But Michelangelo's not interested in animals. He's not even interested in the water. He is interested in nude bodies. You tell all biblical stories through nude bodies if you're Michelangelo. So here there are dozens of figures, some in boats, some over at the Ark, some walking ashore here, that are essentially relaying the story of this great biblical flood here. Almost all of these figures are absolutely nude. And maybe that makes sense because there's just been a flood here. But Michelangelo, as we can see here, is not interested in landscape. We get just like a little green patch of earth, this one sort of wind-blown tree, and then just smooth blue for that water. It's really all about these bodies, and all of them look like they've been sculpted out of marble. Now there's another Noah panel here down below where we can see Noah and his family making animal sacrifices in thanks for being saved. And then the Noah panel ends with this top section here. Sometimes these things are a little out of order. So it ends with this top section where Noah is an old man. This scene is the drunkenness of Noah. We see him twice. Over here, he is farming grapes, and then he gets drunk off of those grapes, and he's lying there nude, and his children come and find him, and they are covering him up, adding a little bit of discretion to this. So, so these three panels here took Michelangelo about 2 years to do. And that probably includes the figures alongside, but we know that this section took about 2 years, which is half of the time, half of his entire time painting the ceiling. But after he was done the Noah panels, he actually took down the scaffolding for the first time, took down the canvases that were there to capture all of the paint droppings. And he invited people in, especially the Pope, who's dying to see what the ceiling looks like. And everybody gets a chance to stand beneath it and sort of see what Michelangelo's been working on for 2 whole years. And Michelangelo stands down almost 70 feet below these paintings, and he gets so angry. The reason he's angry is because 70 feet below these panels, you can't really tell what they're about. The figures are too small. You can barely make out those figures in the distance of those Noah scenes. And so he's resolved to sort of get through this and to make much bigger figures that are much easier to see and tell a much clearer story. So he gets his scaffolding back up, and he is determined to get this done. He just wants this job to be over with. And that brings us to our next section here, which is about the creation of man and the creation of Adam. Everybody has seen this image before. It's one of the most famous images in all of Western art. This is the creation of Adam. And we're going to pause here just for a moment. I like this image because you can see that there are, again, multiple male nude bodies that are just framing it for no reason, but we're going to zoom in just for a second because this is such a lovely high resolution image. Now, we've all seen this picture. We've all sort of noted the fact that there's like this inch of space between Adam's hand and God's hand. But what is this painting really all about? And how does this relate back to Michelangelo and his particular artistic interests and motivations? Well, we have Adam here, who has just been created by God, and he is fully formed physically, at least. He is an idealized nude. He might as well be David standing on a block of marble back in Florence. But in this case, even though he has all the muscles in the world and this, superhero body, he has no energy. It's as though he can't even move this muscled body. He is sitting here on another nondescript patch of earth, and he can hardly raise his hand to meet the finger of God. And let me say that God is not typically depicted in the history of art. It's that's like going against the commandment of making like a graven image. You don't depict your idols in this way. But here, God once again looks like a pagan Zeus. He's got this long white beard, and unusually he is wearing kind of this short little tunic. I mean, when in the rare occasions that artists have depicted God over the centuries, they have put him in like a monarch's robe. They've imbued in him all the dignity of the position. But here, I mean, Michelangelo is just giving him like the simplest of outfits. We can see God's feet. We can see God's knees. This is very unusual. But God is flying in here with all of this energy, all of this zest, and he is about to transfer that over to Adam, who once again can barely lift that finger. God's going to like connect with it. And all of a sudden, Adam will be able to jump up and do anything. That will be like free will. That will be like Adam getting a soul. He'll be a fully formed person at that point. Now, God is surrounded by all of these little putti or cherub like figures, and our eye just tends to go right over them. A lot of them are sort of nondescript. We don't really see too much in terms of their faces. We just get like the adorable elements of these chunky thighs and that sort of thing. But there is one of these putti that seems to be of particular consequence. Notice how God is resting his finger on this one baby over here. So there is some art historical thinking that perhaps with one hand, God is creating Adam and thus original sin. And with his other hand, he has created the Christ child, who is then the sacrifice, the redemption for that sin. Some art historians even take that further and posit that this figure here, who isn't quite a baby, not quite a putti, maybe this is actually Eve, or maybe it's the Virgin Mary sitting alongside the Christ child. These are just kind of alternative readings, but there's another way to understand this particular scene as well. And that is that this entire interesting composition of this swooping drapery around God himself is in fact a reference to the human brain, what the color of the human brain, the shape of the human brain. And Michelangelo, as a Renaissance artist, would have been very interested in anatomy, would have probably taken part in some dissections himself. And wouldn't it just make great sense that that is really what God is bestowing upon Adam in this moment, giving him a brain, giving him free will, giving him the ability to use that beautifully muscled body that he's already created. So a lot of really compelling ways to understand this particular scene. We're going to move a little bit more quickly through the rest of these. We have God here now fully robed with a little bit more dignity, making Eve, and this is Adam lying over here beside her. She's springing from his rib. Notice how masculine her body looks. And part of this is, of course, because Michelangelo wants her body, her being, to be legible from the floor below. But there's a lot of other elements at play. What was considered beautiful in 16th century Italy, Michelangelo's own sexual persuasion. So, I mean, there's a lot of elements informing how he was depicting female bodies. But I think the biggest element guiding here is that he wanted his figures to be legible. In this case, he's borrowing a composition from a little relief carving that he was familiar with during his studies as a student in Bologna, Italy. He would have seen a very similar scene like we see over here on the right. That brings us to the Garden of Eden and the expulsion. This is another iconic scene in Western civilization. This idea of sin and really the repercussions of that sin. We oftentimes see a snake as the serpent that tempts Adam and Eve. There's the one tree that they're not supposed to eat from, traditionally understood as an apple tree. In this case, Michelangelo depicts it as a fig tree. This serpent, this demon, is represented as a woman, interestingly, and we can see that she is handing off to Eve, who now looks almost as muscled as Adam, that piece of fruit. And then they are punished for it, cast out of Eden by this angel who is holding a sword to them as they cower away, totally diminished by this crime. Once again, Michelangelo was borrowing or sort of informing, his composition was informed by other early Italian Renaissance artists. In this case, this is a fresco in Florence by an artist named Masaccio. You can really see that those outlines of the fresco process over here. But leaving Eden, you become ashamed of your nudity. So then we switch gears, and the last three panels are really about actually there are 4 panels. They're about the creation and God specifically creating different parts of the world, parts of the universe even. So Michelangelo is working faster and faster. His figures are becoming bigger and bigger. What these panels that would have taken him months before, he's finishing up in a few weeks. God is taking on all of these unusual poses. This is Michelangelo really showing off what he is able to accomplish. I mean, if I were to give you a pencil right now and say, draw me a picture of a figure, you'd probably just have him standing straight up and looking directly out at us. Having a figure who looks like they're flying out towards you using that kind of foreshortening is, it's showing off. If you're an artist, it's really showing what you can do. So this next scene is called The Second Day, where God divides the waters from heaven. Once again, water is just a blue line. Michelangelo is not concerned with landscape. It's all about the figure. And God here is massive. He's a monumental form, huge muscles, lots of dynamism. This next scene is the third day. God creates earth and it sprouts plants. It's also combined with the fourth day, where God puts the sun and the moon in place. So we see God in 2 different positions. God's beginning to look a little bit angry, right? I always wonder if there's supposed to be a pun here about the sun and the moon. Why would you show God's rear end in this way? But we see God as being very active here, very dynamic. It's still the solitary figure. Michelangelo is working faster and faster and faster. And so then he ends with this last central scene. And this is God creating the universe. It's that first action of separating light from dark. And once again, it's sort of a smaller panel. It's framed by these male nudes. So if we zoom in and rotate, this is what God's doing. God has his hands above his head. He's looking up and he is making the world. In fact, he's standing in exactly the same position as Michelangelo, who's been working with his hands over his head for the past 4 years. And Michelangelo is able to create this entire panel in just one day. He's working so quickly. So there's this incredible resonance between God's work and Michelangelo's work as he gets to the end of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. There are some people that know a lot more about brain anatomy that say that there are other references to the brain in this particular painting. I can't really say anything more about that because I don't know anything about neuroanatomy. But as we zoom out once again, I just want to note some of these large framing figures on either side. Those figures are sibyls and prophets that are there to tell the story of, really to connect the Old Testament to the New Testament. And these are like these massive, oversized figures that all have these incredible texts that they're reading from. The sibyls are all female, and these are probably 3 of the best known sibyls: the Cumean sibyl, the Libyan sibyl, and the Delphic symbol. And these poses are so integrated into our visual culture, we don't even often recognize when they're being quoted. But of course, these are also opportunities to recognize that Michelangelo made his female figures just as massive and muscular and as impressive as his male figures in these really dynamic poses that sort of start with this flexed toe over here and twist this body to this massively muscled shoulder over here about to pick up this book. If we look at some of the prophets, again, they're even bigger. They're really incredible. This is Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah over here. They're just absolutely enormous figures, so impressive in their scale, their weight, their monumentality. And of course, I mentioned before, they are the basis of so many visual references in our society. You probably have already made the connection between Michelangelo's prophet Isaiah and Norman Rockwell's famous depiction of Rosie the Riveter. He borrowed Michelangelo's composition here in order to create a modern day saint. All right, so as we wrap up with the commission and the execution here, just a quick note to say that one of Michelangelo's rivals, Raphael, who was in every way a different temperament from Michelangelo, he was somebody that could get along with anybody. He was a social butterfly and a little bit of a ladies' man. He had a very cushy commission at the same time that Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling and struggling up there on the scaffolding. Raphael was painting the Pope's apartment. So he got to hobnob with everybody going in and out. He could chit chat with the Pope while he was painting all day. And he created this wonderful series of the cycle of murals. And we can see just a few of them here, including the most famous one, which is called the School of Athens. And in the School of Athens, he has created this imagined assembly of some of the world's greatest thinkers throughout history. It's said that this kind of airy architectural space that they occupy here was inspired by St. Peter's Basilica, the Vatican Church that was being built at the same time. You have Plato and Aristotle right here at the center. There's Raphael's self-portrait over here on the far right, and all of these references to mathematicians and to philosophers throughout. But it was said that after Raphael went and glimpsed at the Sistine Chapel ceiling, when Michelangelo was done, he came back in and added this figure here of a very forlorn and melancholy looking figure who's leaning against a massive block of marble and writing away perhaps another sort of aching sonnet like we saw before. So it seems as though Raphael included a nice homage to Michelangelo in his work here. So I'm going to very quickly cover the addition, and that is the Last Judgment, the east end of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo was called back more than 2 decades after he finished the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He was 59 years old and asked to paint another huge fresco. This one took him much longer. It took him until he was 66 in order to finish it. Imagine being 66 years old and climbing up and down, painting this huge wall here. So this is a Last Judgment scene. This is a traditional subject for the east end of any church. And the Last Judgment is really Christ or God deciding who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. In this case, he is surrounded by saints in this kind of heavenly realm. This is Christ here at the center, flanked by his mother Mary and all of these nude saints. And then we have this kind of earthly realm down below. And we're going to take it apart a little bit. Here, as we zoom in over on the left, in this earthly realm, we have the saved, we have the people who are ascending up into heaven and being sort of pulled out of their graves by some of these saints. As you can see here, everyone is remarkably muscled, even if they are essentially, coming back from the dead in this moment. Even the saints have these incredible bodies. At this point, Michelangelo is adding in muscles that do not exist. He is such a fanatic about muscles. I always think if he were alive today, he'd be very into like the WWF. So we have, skeletal remains coming out of their graves and all of these people going up to heaven. Now, on the other side of the composition, we have the flip side of the coin. We have people who are being dragged down to hell. And Michelangelo, like so many artists before him, I think has sort of some fun imagining just how terrifying that process could be, being condemned to hell. And so there are all these angels that are sort of punching the damned down into their place or dragging them down. Once again, look at this back. Look at this arm. I mean, if you saw someone who looked like that in real life, you'd be kind of worried about them. There's just too many muscles, too many bumps here, and all sorts of unusual positions as well. But it's this figure over here. I always think of this as like the ultimate figure of regret, that look of alarm on his face as he's being pulled down into hell by multiple figures. Notice too how he's being bitten on his thigh by this serpent. We know with certainty that Michelangelo was in Rome when this famous classical sculpture called the Laocoon was excavated in the early part of the 1500s. And you can see here, there's a similar snake biting the side of this main figure here who's looks like he's just in agony. And there's no doubt that this probably inspired Michelangelo's composition on the east end of the Sistine Chapel. Now, just a few more details of hell. There's also this boat here where there are demons pushing people out of the boat and then into the depths of hell. The demons get even worse as you get sort of lower and closer to the corner. Some of them have wings and like these sort of like bird talons. Some of them have horns. And you'll notice this one figure in the corner over here. He's standing up. There's a snake wrapped around him, actually biting his genitals. Ouch. And he also has these huge ears. And that figure is based on a specific person, a cardinal who had been particularly critical of Michelangelo's nudes. So you don't cross Michelangelo because he is going to give you ass ears and send you to hell in his paintings. And this figure is like right over the door going into the Sistine Chapel. So Michelangelo just sort of set him up to be laughed at for all eternity. That is some pretty sweet revenge right there. So if we zoom back out and look up at that heavenly realm again, we can see that Michelangelo is really focusing on the bodies. He includes the little attributes that help us identify the saints. Like for instance, this is Saint Peter. He's been given the keys to the kingdom, and so he's holding a key, but he's nude, and that is the case for so many of these saints. Another saint that has been identified is this figure here, and that is Saint Bartholomew. And when he was martyred, he was flayed alive, which means his skin was cut off of his living body. So he is holding that knife, the instrument of his martyrdom, up above him, and it almost just touches Christ over here. In his other hand, he is actually holding his skin, the skin that's been cut off of his body. And it's, I think, generally understood that that sagging skin hanging out of his hands here is a self-portrait by Michelangelo, which gives us a little bit of insight into maybe how he was feeling about this specific project. It's said that there is at least one other self-portrait of Michelangelo hidden in the Sistine Chapel ceiling. So as we shift gears here, I just wanted to draw your attention finally to the fact that many of the nudes in the Last Judgment seem to have these tiny little swaths of fabric, making them just a little bit more modest. Not all of them, but there's a lot of them. And that's because there was an artist who was hired after the fact to go in and cover as many genitals as possible with these little loincloths. And he went down in history with this horrible nickname from the Italians. It was basically like the painter of bikini bottoms or the breeches maker, something like that, because you don't go in and fix a Michelangelo, but it was just considered a little too much adult content for this wall. So that is still there. Now let's talk a little bit about the Sistine Chapel ceiling still being there today and what it looks like. Now, for years, I mean, many of you probably remember growing up and seeing the Sistine Chapel looking this way, either in person or in photographs and reproductions. And it wasn't until 1980 that a massive restoration was begun at the Sistine Chapel. Now, why did it get so dirty? Well, there were a lot of people that went in and out over the years, but it was also the candles and the torches that really kind of darkened the ceiling. And I think for a long time, people thought that it should have looked this way. These dark paintings, don't they sort of align with our understanding of who Michelangelo was? He was a moody guy. He was like depressive. He didn't get along with people. Why wouldn't he paint a really dark painting like this? Well, once they started removing some of the filth and the grime from this painting and revealing these kind of vivid, bright colors. I mean, Michelangelo was painting practically in Technicolor. There were some people who were immediately alarmed and thought that this conservation crew was taking away too much, like removing too much Michelangelo. And that is sort of part and parcel with any sort of restoration project. You can see over here that that as they lightened up this figure on the right, that you can see like elements of that figure have been brought to almost a white highlight over here. They also left these windows throughout the Sistine Chapel ceiling, and you might have noticed them throughout the program today. But these little windows show what that section of the wall or the ceiling looked like prior to conservation. So that blue background, that blue sky there was practically black, which is shocking. In this comparison here, you can see pre-restoration and post-restoration. Yes, her eyeballs are basically invisible now, but you can really see the other elements of the picture, which had sort of been obscured by all of the dirt from over the years. These are just some great images of like the before and after here in the Garden of Eden, here with the creation of man, how dramatic that restoration is. A lot of those cracks are gone now. And then, of course, the dramatic before and after with God creating the universe, separating light from dark. So these days, you'll never believe how many people go through the Sistine Chapel every single day, about 35,000 people, no, 25,000 people. So that is still really close to about the number of people that go through Fenway Park on a given night when there's a ball game. So that's a lot of people. You typically don't get as much time as you would want just sitting there, and you might not even fully understand what you're looking at as you're there. So hopefully today is a really good primer for understanding before you go. Now, we're just going to sort of wrap up with Michelangelo's final contributions, because things didn't just end for him when he was done with the painting. He was sort of continually involved with the Vatican throughout his life, and he was called back actually to improve the architectural plan for the St. Peter's itself, for that church, which started off with Bramante, the man who set him up to fail. Michelangelo was called in to improve this plan, and we can see what he did was he just made it more muscular. He added muscles to things. He took away delicate little columns, and he beefed everything up so that it had a more kind of imposing presence. Ultimately, his plan was updated to what we know today, the Latin cross version of Michelangelo's church. So this is, of course, St. Peter's today. And Michelangelo continued to sculpt throughout his life too. One of his final sculptures was something that he took on himself. And it's a deposition scene, a scene where three figures are taking the dead Christ off of the cross and sort of supporting, holding up his body here. Now, this was something that Michelangelo decided to work on for himself. This wasn't even a commission. He's about 72 years old when he's working on it. It's sort of like the scene before we get to the Pietà. It's a nice little bookend to his career. And amazingly, it's thought that this figure here of Nicodemus is a self-portrait of the artist. So towards the end of his life, after all of this service to the church, all of these projects that he didn't necessarily want to be working on, he portrays himself as somebody who's essentially holding up this religion, holding up the symbol of this religion, Jesus, in the final years of his life. And he certainly had that kind of outsized role in the storytelling associated with the Catholic Church during the Renaissance. Now, Michelangelo died just 2 weeks before his 89th birthday, a nice long life for him. And his nephew brought his body from Rome back to Florence, and he is buried at the Church of Santa Croce in Florence. You can still go and see his tomb there. We'll end this afternoon with just the reflection of of, you know, what a gift it is to share Michelangelo's incredible work and to reflect upon the fact that it is still so highly valued and appreciated even now, 500 years later. So I'll end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you might have about Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel.
I've got a question, Jane. This is Dana. I've read things about him and his dissections. Evidently, he was very interested in science. And would you say that there's a connection between how exacting he is with drawing as well as sculpting bodies that has probably come as a benefit from that interest?
I would agree with that, Dina. I think, I mean, he is trying to capture really what human anatomy looks like, but it's all kind of informed by this attempt at capturing the divine too. So he's trying to get the human body perfect, but also make it look better than the average body, which is why we get all the muscles too. I'm just trying to find a really good example of that. That might even be with like the David in the beginning, but it's certainly linked to his understanding of science too. And this is all kind of revolutionary for the time too, because even early Renaissance artists weren't as interested in these aspects of science and anatomy and dissection. You don't have like artists like Botticelli, who also painted frescoes in the Sistine Chapel. You don't have him doing dissections like this. I mean, he's really rooting his understanding of the world in essentially what other artists had been doing and was informed by the church, but Michelangelo was rooting what he was doing in the observable world and in scientific thinking. So you have that, but it is married with this other element of perfection too. So great question, Dana. It sort of like wraps that all up very nicely.
Thank you. Who else has? I see Giselle has a question.
Hi,
Yes,
Giselle.
Giselle.
Hi, I just was wondering, did Leonardo predate all this work by Michelangelo and his exploration of anatomy? Did that play into Michelangelo's
Yes.
work?
So Leonardo was about 25 years older than Michelangelo, if I'm remembering correctly. So if you can imagine that dynamic, I have a whole other program on them as frenemies, and they were really more like enemies than frenemies. But Leonardo was just as interested in anatomy and dissection, probably maybe even more so than Michelangelo. And he had already been introducing this kind of scientific approach to painting that I have no doubt influenced Michelangelo, particularly when it came to a painting like this, because this is just a few years after something like the Mona Lisa was painted. So all of these things are happening at the same time, but Leonardo da Vinci was doing it first. At the same time, Michelangelo was considered, again, the best in all of the art forms. So even though da Vinci was out there, Michelangelo was still considered better by his contemporaries, I should say.
Thank you for the question, Giselle. Other questions?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah, I think
Rachel.
so.
Yes.
Okay. I read like the Irving Stone book a while back, and it seemed like artists had like schools, like students who worked for them
Yes.
and who did like a lot of their artwork, but it was like attributed to like the artist whose school it was. Is that the case here too?
That's such a good question, Rachel. So all of these Renaissance artists had apprentices, they had people who were prepping things for them. And it wouldn't be unusual for a master artist to maybe add a few of their flourishes and sign their name to a work of art. I think there's one early Renaissance artist where I can think of a lot of museum examples where it's attributed to Perugino, but he probably only painted the face or the hands and everything else was painted by his students. I don't think that that is the case with the Sistine Chapel ceiling. We do know that he had assistants, but we also know that he was hard to work with. We also know that he dismissed a lot of his assistants that were mixing the plaster that he was painting in. So they might have been helping out with the application of like the cartoons, that the charcoal drawing to the wall. But I mean, even when you look at those charcoal drawings, they look so much like Michelangelo's hand. It would be hard for me to imagine that those were being produced by his students. So I think when it comes to the actual figures on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, I mean, my hunch is that this is really as much of Michelangelo's work as imaginable. But that's such a great question, Rachel. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Other questions for Jane? I've got another question. You made mention of that situation where he was recalled back to do those last panels, and instantly I noticed that people were clothed, or at the very least, like you said, sort
Little
of having,
loincloths, yeah.
yeah, right. But it was pretty obvious after seeing so much just bodies. Was that something, back to the nudity, was he chastised at all for depicting people unclothed, or was that something that was part of the style of that time?
I think it was, I mean, he was chastised. Obviously, there was criticism, enough so that somebody else was hired to go in and make those little corrections throughout. And of course, the cardinal that criticized him was captured forever as this kind of ass down below. I get the feeling that that there was like a shift in terms of what people were comfortable with by this time, because he wasn't hired to go back and fix the central axis of the Sistine Chapel, where there's so many nudes, but those are also, you know, Adam and Eve. So it would seem sort of inappropriate to give Adam and Eve, who are always depicted as nudes, any sort of loincloth. But you bring up such a great point, Dana. I think that there was certainly a shift in the way people felt about nudity, and that's probably what led to that. And I'm not sure, well, I'm certain that Michelangelo would have stood by his original creation there.
Thanks for shedding that light on there. I see that Joan had a comment that I wanted to go back to. Joan writes, what about the background of God looking like a human brain? Isn't that a current theory these days?
As far as I know, that's pretty current. It's one of those theories that you can't really prove. It's just a theory. And I think I don't think it's been disproven. I don't think anybody who really knows neuroanatomy says, no, this is so off, it doesn't really line up. So I think it's a really compelling theory. And since it aligns so nicely with what is happening in the scene outside of, you know, the brain itself, it's a really kind of wonderful theory to indulge in. There's certainly a lot of debate about who these putti might be over here, but I love the theory of the brain.
I find the picture that you have up there, I find it interesting that it almost appears that God has breasts, doesn't it? If you look at that. And so, you know, it seems incongruous to, you know, what we would anticipate, but I don't, it's got to be intentional, right? Or am I reading into that?
I mean, actually, Dana, I've wondered about that for so long myself. It's a really strange choice. I mean, maybe they're breasts, or maybe they are just really gigantic pectoral muscles. I mean, Michelangelo is really trying to make God look physically impressive. It's hard to know, but I mean, my eyes go there too. There's a lot of strange things about this depiction of God the fact that he's wearing so little clothes here is really unusual. And even as I'm looking at it now, it's like he's got a very clear demarcation of where this sleeve is. And this sleeve sort of seems to extend much longer and maybe only end behind this figure's head. It's a strange, it's a strange body, a strange way to depict God. I think Michelangelo sort of wanted us to focus on this face and the curling beard, flowing in the air, but that body is kind of mysterious for sure.
Worthy of mentioning while you're on this slide is if you take a look at his hand that's on what you thought may have been a younger Jesus. Yeah. Take a look at how his right arm is so flowy and natural. And yet this to me looks, the index finger is almost overly large, and it's almost contorted, right? It's got to be for a reason.
Right. Actually, I would say that the anatomy is really off. It seems as though the anatomy is off for this arm over here. It seems as though he's trying to do something with it that doesn't kind of work. It seems like a much longer arm than this arm.
Yes.
I've never even realized that. So I'm glad you're pointing all of this out, but I would agree. It seems like there's a special emphasis on that gesture. In fact, almost more so than the gesture over here. It seems it's like there's concerted effort to draw your attention to it.
Lots of good praise as always. Just a comment from Jennifer. I assume it's because God made Adam in his own image. I'm not sure.
Oh, probably, the reason why God has to be so physically impressive, if Adam's going to look this good, God has to look this good, kind of thing.
We've gotten a request for a little bit of a preview of your upcoming program. I recognize Len has a question. We'll circle back. The Van Gogh coming up January 8th. Can you give us just a little bit of a insight into that?
Absolutely. We will be getting much more familiar with Vincent van Gogh, with some of his struggles, sort of the evolution of his work by looking at sort of the different categories of his paintings, from still lifes, which would include his florals, to landscapes, which would include Starry Night. We'll end with the sort of salacious story of the artist and his ear. I think it's what, along with the Michelangelo presentation, it's one of my absolute favorites because you just fall in love with Vincent van Gogh. Your heart goes out to him. He's was such a remarkable person. So you're in for a treat with that one. But you go right inside the asylum with him in that presentation and you see what he was going through when he created Starry Night. So there's a lot to look forward to with that one.
Thank you. So a couple questions still here. Len, it seems as though you have a question for Jane.
Yes, just first and foremost, you did a fantastic job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done and concise. I was interrupted on the piece where it was Michelangelo's self-image with the knife hanging above and the skin hanging down. Could you just briefly comment again on what was that about?
So he's surrounded by saints up here, and they all can be identified through their attributes, which are typically the instruments of their martyrdom. So when it comes to this figure right here, this is Saint Bartholomew, who was flayed alive. His skin was cut off his body. That was how he was martyred. And he's holding the skin that was presumably cut off of his body. And art historians generally agree that this is a self-portrait by Michelangelo.
Excellent. Thank you so much for going back. Like I said, I was interrupted by that. And again, a fantastic, presentation, very interesting and concise and to the point. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lynn. I appreciate that.
I also think Linda had a question. Also, we'd like to circle back.
It's my husband, Dave.
Hi, Dave. Hi, Linda.
More of a comment than a question. First, I want to say that I agree with Len, and I think we all do. You hit another Grand Slam home run. It was a great lecture. But the way art historians, I'm not sure how art historians did before the 20th century really studied the Sistine Chapel. we were lucky enough to be there once, and it was as if a group of people in a stadium were emptying at one time through the chapel doors, moving towards the other end. Even people with telescopes and stuff had to be very careful, or else they would have been trampled by the people behind them. I mean, it was very unfortunate. And you know, of course, you have the close-ups, of course,
Yeah.
to allow everyone to appreciate, you know, what an incredible, just an absolutely incredible feat this was. But the a lecture like yours and the reality of going through the chapel are quite different. Yours is much better.
You just made my day, Dave. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I remember when I was in the Sistine Chapel, I sat down on a little bench on the side and I was just looking up. And I think I was there for about an hour. And I remember just feeling exhausted after that hour. And it was like, it was hard to look. It was hard to know where to look. It was just like, it's really visually overwhelming. So it's pretty nice to be able to just sit back in the comfort of your own home and zoom in on some of these details and really get a little backstory about what they're really about. So I'm so glad you enjoyed it, Dave, and thank you for your kind words. And thank you, Rachel and Michelle and other people, Linda, for your very kind words too. They mean a lot to me.
Terrific. Any other questions or comments for Jane? I think, Jane, you've got your own following here. I don't know of a single person that doesn't feel like I do. So I know a lot of times you seem to think I'm in isolation, but I would say it's the overwhelming feeling of, as I always say, a term paper about ... name the artist, right?
Well, thank you, everybody, for giving
Thank
me the
you.
opportunity to do this because I really love it. Thank you.
Any last minute questions or comments? Please just jump in. Well, seeing no other things in the chat or hearing from no one else, as always, Jane, thank you. Thank you. It's always a great Sunday afternoon to be spent with you. And we'll wish everybody a pleasant holiday season and look forward to see people again in January. Again, that link is up for the January 8th program. Jane did give us a little bit of a look behind the curtain as to what we can expect. And I think it'll be just as good as all of her previous programs. So thank you to everybody. Have a great rest of the afternoon and enjoy the day. Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Dana.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.